Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
There's a feeling that Rishi is golden boy at the moment. He's had a very slick media management. Yesterday he told MPs that, people had laughed at him for sort of putting his signature on all the good news in the past year. And he sort of said, look, I hope you can now see I'm willing to put my name on the difficult stuff too.
Spend now, pay later.
We will continue doing whatever it takes to support the British people and businesses through this moment of crisis. In today's budget, we begin the work of building our future economy.
As expected, Rishi Sunak promised to spend billions of pounds of your money to pay for the government's response to the pandemic for months to come in his budget yesterday. But tax rises too. So how will all of this affect the money in your pocket? I'm joined now by two people whose job it is to work out the answer to that very question. Julian Jessop, Economics Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and the Telegraph's Deputy Political Editor, Lucy Fisher. Good morning, both.
Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Now, to you first, Julian, to summarise the budget in a tweet. How would you do it?
Well, I actually did that first thing this morning. I think there's three big positives and two negatives. On the positive side, first of all, he extended the emergency support. So that's things like the uplift to universal credit and the furlough scheme for at least as long as the lockdown is going to remain in place, but no longer. So the really big spending is going to start to be wound down no later than September. The second thing he did, though, was to start to raise taxes. He announced some quite big increases in both personal tax and in corporate tax. At least those increases aren't going to kick in for a while. So the income tax changes don't start for another year. Corporation tax isn't rising until 2023, but there's still quite a lot of money that would be taken out of people's pockets one way or another that way. The third thing he did, though, was that he is quite positive about the economy for a change. He was helped there by some more optimistic forecasts from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility about growth and unemployment. And where there was bad news in the budget, he was quite transparent about it. So he didn't hide the fact that people would be paying more in tax than they would otherwise have done.
Yeah.
On the downside, though, I think this is some big risks here. I mean, I don't think there's any need to raise taxes now, and the increase in corporation tax in particular, even though it's still a few years away, is pretty risky. But overall, I think he played a bad hand pretty well.
That's about 20 tweets, but I'll let you off, Julian Jessop. But Lucy Fisher, would you summarise it quickly?
Well, I totally agree with what Julian's just said. He had a difficult hand. He laid bare the enormous cost of the government's coronavirus support and the parlous state of the economy. I think it's interesting. He did present his, huge tax raid, which is destined to bring in 21 billion over 5 years to individuals, let alone business, as honesty. But I think an interesting question, in the aftermath of the budget is, has he been honest enough? For me, a really interesting part of the budget was this further cut to public spending that was sort of hidden, wasn't on the Treasury scorecard, but it was hidden in the documents, this 4 billion that will be cut from day-to-day spending in the years ahead. That comes after a 10 billion cut on day-to-day spending each year that was announced in the spending review. There's a lot of sort of discussion now about whether some departments that don't have protected day-to-day budgets are going to see austerity. And that leads me to the question, are we actually going to have to see more tax rises down the line or more cuts and that sort of austerity sense in order to stabilise debt?
Yeah, so austerity being the word which Boris Johnson hates using. We'll come to the future in a minute, but just looking at this budget, Julian Jessop, do you think we now see Rishi Sunak as a kind of Harold Macmillan figure with a belief in the state and less of the Thatcherite we thought he may have been?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that part of the explanation, though, for the increase in taxes was precisely because he wants to keep spending down in future. So lots of people ahead of this budget were asking that, who would tax rises be aimed at in terms of, what is the audience? Because most independent economists, outside observers don't think it's necessary to raise taxes now. The financial markets certainly don't. But I would say it's maybe aimed at the general public and his own colleagues in the cabinet. People that might have looked at the big increase in government spending over the last year or so and say, well, we've been able to do this relatively cheaply. We want more of this. So I think he was partly sending a warning signal to those that do want the state to continue to grow, saying that if you do so, there are sort of painful consequences in terms of increases in personal or corporation tax.
Staying on that, Julian, how worried are you about gilt yields and the fact that I was talking to someone at the Treasury last night, very senior, close to Rishi Sunak, and they are worried about just slight changes on the cost of borrowing on the markets will just wipe out these increases. I think the OBR has said that the 17 billion they're raising from corporation tax would go with just a 1% increase in interest rates. I mean, we are very, very vulnerable, are we not, to those macroeconomic shifts?
Well, I'm relatively relaxed about that for two reasons. First of all, I think interest rates will remain relatively low for the foreseeable future. There's been a bit of a panic in the markets over the last week or so, but even then, it costs less than 1% to borrow for 10 years if you're the government. So interest rates are still relatively low now. The second and more important point, though, is you have to ask why interest rates would rise. And it's most likely to be because the economy is recovering more strongly than expected. Inflation may be picking up too. And those changes in the economy are actually very positive for the public finances. So, tax revenues would be higher. The government can cut spending in other areas more quickly. And so the net effect of a rise in interest rates, given the economic backdrop, might actually be positive for the public finances rather than negative.
Is that right, Lucy Fisher? Do you think that he is basically just taking a punt here, that, that there won't be a problem here with interest rates going forward?
Well, Chris, I've definitely picked up, as you have, real jitters. Tory MPs again telling me that the Chancellor is very worried. Andy Holden, the chief economist at the Bank of England, warning that the inflation tiger is on the prowl last week and what that could do to interest rates. And you've already outlined how that could wipe out the huge amount of revenue raised by this massive hike in corporation tax. I think there are concerns in the Treasury about how exposed the UK debt position is. And I think that's certainly some of the signalling yesterday and the tough rhetoric on trying to get a grip of the public finances was aimed at trying to reassure the international markets.
If inflation rises, then again, you have to ask why inflation is rising. As far as the debt burden is concerned, it's the level of real interest rates. In other words, interest rates adjusted for inflation that matters. So if, for the sake of argument, inflation rises to 3% and interest rates rise to 2%, that's still negative real interest rates. That's still an environment in which the government can borrow pretty large sums of money. And over time, the increase in the size of the economy will reduce the burden of debt. So I don't think it's enough to say that inflation might rise, particularly if inflation rises because the economy is getting back to normal, more people are in work, wages are going up and so on.
Lucy, on the individual taxation rates, of course, the thresholds were frozen for income tax. That's a big blow. But equally, there was some good news for home buyers, wasn't there?
There was indeed a 6-month extension to the stamp duty holiday, keeping that nil band rate up to £500,000 for 3 months and then tapering it. So the nil band rate goes up to half of that for another 3 months before we, at the end of September, get back to the original regime, which is where the nil band rate finishes at £125,000. And of course, it's a big victory for the Telegraph's Stamp Out Our Duty campaign. And Chris, you noticed the Prime Minister's reaction yourself, didn't you?
Yes, he hates stamp duty and he campaigned to be leader in 2019 against stamp duty. And when Rishi Sunak was announcing his plans, he looked up at the press gallery and gave me a big thumbs up, which I thought was quite funny. There's also good news for first-time buyers, aren't there, Lucy, on these new 95% mortgages?
Absolutely. And I think that is politically a deft move from Rishi Sunak, clearly aimed at younger people trying to get on the housing ladder, and a constituent that sometimes, certainly tends to vote much more for Labour. So important for the Conservatives to try and pitch to that constituency too.
I forget what the age is when people move across from Labour to Tory. I think it's like 45 now, isn't it? So they want to bring that age down so you can be a Conservative or at least think well about the Tories at a younger age to ensure the party has a long-term future, I suppose. In terms of the reaction overnight, the polls are quite good, aren't they, Lucy? 46% according to YouGov, like what they've heard so far, 11% against. Is that because we haven't yet seen the wrinkles in the Red Book, which you'll be revealing in the Telegraph tomorrow?
Well, I think in part it's that, but in another way, some of the papers have kind of classed this a spend now, tax later budget. There are a lot of giveaways, and the pain announced has been sort of thrown further down the line. So in a way, I'm not surprised that many people are happy with it. There's a huge amount of support. The COVID support continues. We've seen, the uplift in universal credit extended for another 6 months, the furlough scheme extended, the business rates holiday extended for retail, hospitality and leisure. So I think it's unsurprising. And of course, we must remember that the OBR forecasts were better than many had predicted as well, particularly when you look at unemployment.
Yes.
Last summer, it was predicted to rise to 12%, which is just huge. Whereas yesterday, we saw that the new forecasts have been revised right down to say that unemployment will peak at 6.5% at the end of this year.
Which is marvellous. So, but on those growth figures, Julian Jessop, do you think that obviously the economy is due to go gangbusters second half this year, next year, and I think the year after, and then growth has becalmed quite a lot. Is that pessimistic, you think?
Yes, I actually think the OBR's forecasts are still too pessimistic. For a start, I actually think the economy will rebound much more quickly than they anticipate. Once the brakes are taken off, I think there's an enormous amount of pent-up demand. We're all desperate to go out and spend, and I think businesses will want to spend a lot more as well. So I think we could get back to pre-COVID levels of economic activity, even later this year, let alone in the middle of next year, as the OBR expects. The OBR is also still pessimistic about the long-term economic impact of COVID. It still thinks that the economy will be 3% smaller than it would otherwise have been in a few years' time. And that is, when people talk about there being a black hole in the public finances, that's really what they're talking about.
That's the scarring they just describe it, i.e. the scar that you can't get rid of. Scarring is permanent.
Yeah, exactly. That's because of things like, an increase in unemployment and a loss of skills and the loss of investment, all those sorts of things. But I actually think that the crisis, although it's obviously ghastly, particularly in terms of the impact on the nation's health and well-being, it is an opportunity to reboot productivity and so on. I think there might be some small long-term economic positives. But either way, I think the economy will continue to recover more quickly than most people anticipate. And the tax increases that were announced yesterday, I think will be more than enough to fill any black hole in the public finances. And it won't be too long again before we can start talking about tax cuts.
Are you seeing a similar reaction, a good one, for Rishi Sunak in the city today?
There's a little bit of nervousness about some things. I mean, that's a much bigger increase in corporation tax than most people were anticipating. Also, some traders in the bond market are concerned that the government is planning to issue more bonds over the coming year than had been anticipated. So there might be a bit of indigestion in the bond market there. But the bottom line is that gilt yields should remain low, not just because they're going to be anchored by what the Bank of England does. A lot of the gilts, of course, are held by the Bank of England and financed at the Bank of England's official rate. And even if the gilt market sells off a little bit, I don't think that rate is going to rise for some time yet.
I'm always struck by how almost supine I thought companies are with corporation tax. I was at the CBI conference in November 2019 when, during the election campaign, Boris Johnson came on and abandoned the corporation tax cut at the CBI. I mean, it's quite amazing. It was that cut which George Osborne tried to do, was to bring it down to, I think it was 17% from 19%. And he just told them they weren't going to do it. And there was not a peep from the CBI. They just sat there looking. I think at that point in life, they were more worried about a Jeremy Corbyn government, what he might do. And so Johnson got away with it. But even the CBI were quite welcoming, weren't they, to this budget yesterday?
Well, I think there are a couple of positive, or at least less negative things you can say about what he's done on corporation tax. One is at least he's provided some certainty. It's certainty of a bad outcome, but he's set up a clear plan for what's going to happen to corporation tax, and businesses do like the certainty. Secondly, he has sort of put in a few offsets, so it won't affect some of the smaller companies that don't make large profits. And then there's fiddling around on investment allowances as well. So for at least the next couple of years, there's a big benefit to anybody who decides to invest in plant and machinery. So there's some offsets there as well.
I was lurking outside Committee Room 14 last night, Lucy Fisher, at the House of Commons, trying to speak to Tory MPs, and they were becalmed. Rishi Sunak popped in to speak to them, and then they all listened and heard. One Tory MP left and gave me this quote, and this is about Boris Johnson. He said, "I say this with a smile, but the PM is such a formidable politician, he could eat your heart in front of you and you wouldn't know it was missing until he swallowed the last mouthful."
Gosh, what a fantastic quote. Wow.
And he was so pleased with the quote, he then texted me a cleaned up version of it afterwards.
Well, that is.
He can do nothing wrong, Boris Johnson, and therefore Rishi Sunak. It does seem like the stars are aligned at the moment. And, well, we'll come on to Keir Starmer shortly, but the Tory reaction, I mean, there's no talk of rebellion, is there? I mean, there was talk in the Sunday papers, not in our paper, the Telegraph, but other papers who were not as uninformed, talking about a rebellion. People might vote against parts of the budget. What do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Any sort of dissent is becalmed. We did see in the chamber yesterday a few figures, notably sort of David Davis raising concerns about the rise to corporation tax, Mark Harper as well, sort of arguing that it could, stifle investment and growth. But, these are sort of usual suspects, people who have become quite vocal in their criticism of the government. I was interested, for example, in the extension to universal credit uplift. It's been extended for 6 months, falling far short of the year-long extension that many MPs had requested. We've seen a rebellion on this earlier this year. Last month, the Telegraph revealed that Stephen Crabb, the former Work and Pensions Secretary, was leading 40 MPs in a sort of private lobbying campaign to the Prime Minister and Chancellor.
For a full year, wasn't it?
For a full year. And even, Stephen Crabb, when I spoke to him yesterday on record, was saying, he very much welcomed the extension for 6 months and was glad that the Chancellor had listened. So you're right, there's a feeling that Rishi is golden boy at the moment. He's had a very slick media management. Yesterday he told MPs that, people had laughed at him for sort of putting his signature on all the good news in the past year, the handouts, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. And he sort of said, look, I hope you can now see I'm willing to put my name on the difficult stuff too. But, and this is a big but, we do know, don't we, Chris, from covering previous budgets, that it can be in the days and weeks afterwards that details unravel and holes can be picked. So I think he's not he's not in the all clear yet. We need to see sort of how the next few days pan out as everyone pores over the detail in the Red Book and the OBR.
That's the Tories, Lucy Fisher. But how about Keir Starmer and Labour? I mean, where on earth does he go for here? Because yet again, the Tories, I liken them to a snake that every 3 years they just they shed their skin and become a new snake. I mean, the government's been in power for 10 years now, and it's completely kind of changed the way it looks and the way it's dealing with policy. And where on earth, if you're opposing it, where do you go?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I do think we're going to hear more in the next 48 hours about the cut to public spending that I mentioned earlier. And in particular, questions about where those cuts will fall. We know that the NHS, schools and defence have protected budgets. They received multi-year funding settlements set out in cash terms. But every other department, if we are going to see this pretty seismic fall in day-to-day spending in the annual budgets given to departments. I've spoken to both Labour MPs and a number of economists yesterday who pointed out it's going to be a real squeeze potentially for prisons, for local government, also departments like the Home Office, which also have an extra burden in the post-Brexit era, perhaps would be wanting to see funding going up, not down. I think Labour are going to be really focusing on where those cuts could fall and really pushing this austerity sense and narrative that, as you've pointed out, the Prime Minister, absolute anathema to him. He sort of pledged there won't be a return to austerity. So it'll be a battle of the narratives on that front.
And we're looking forward then, aren't we, already into the comprehensive spending review, the 3-year one, probably this November, with another tax-raising budget. Julian Jessop, where do you think he might try and raise more money? Would it be in lifting NICs, national insurance for self-employed, forcing pensioners to pay national insurance, lifting CGT to income tax levels?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think he will need to raise tax because the economy will recover sufficiently strongly that he doesn't have to. But you're right, there are lots of things that were being talked about ahead of this budget that he's left in his back pocket if he needs to do it. So things like restricting the rate of tax relief on pensions to the basic rate. So that could take billions or even tens of billions out of higher income taxpayers, which it's not ideal, but politically that's probably acceptable. And there are various other things he can do around wealth taxes and about equalising the treatment of different forms of income, including, you could say, self-employment income versus employment income. So there are more things that he can do, but I don't think he will have to do anything more. As to the spending side, it's worth remembering that we went into this pandemic with the government spending about 40% of national income. So that's already a pretty high level. And I'd be surprised if there weren't some cuts that you could make there and still leave plenty of money to do the things that I think we'd all agree the state should be doing.
And nothing on social care, Lucy Fisher. That's one of the big issues which Jeremy Hunt overnight has talked about. Appreciate that there's no money at the moment to given the focus on coronavirus, but there's no even direction either behind the policy.
No, and I think that we will hear more about that too. We've seen, I think in the past decade, it's something like...
I hope so. It's been waiting for long enough.
Well, I was going to say, I think we've seen something like 14 green and white papers on social care reform in the past decade. And it just, no government can ever really grasp this nettle. It was a manifesto pledge that the government would look to reform the system. So I think there will be growing questions, if not now, when? We're already 1 year into this parliament. Many people think Boris Johnson will probably not leave it to the last minute to call an election. He might plump for 2023 rather than 2024. So the government really need to kind of get on with it if they want to kind of get into the detail and substance of reforms, but in this parliamentary cycle.
Do you think, Lucy Fisher, this may have made a 2023 election more likely? That's been mooted this morning because you'd have an election before these big increases in business tax come in.
Well, I think there's a lot of sort of cynicism around what could happen. I've spoken to people speculating that perhaps Rishi Sunak would, he's announced this huge hike to corporation tax, a 6 percentage point jump from 19% to 25%. Could he look to try and cut that and present that as a cut, perhaps to 23% when we actually get to 2023? Who knows? I think the big kind of question is what the public finances look like. I'm very buoyed by what Julian has said that he thinks the OBR have been a little bit pessimistic about growth and the economic recovery. I think if the economy is looking strong, the public finances are strong and carry the government along, then certainly we could see the government plumping for it earlier. They'll look for that moment of positivity and optimism, won't they?
And just finally, Julian Jessop, do you think this budget marked the moment the Tories finally buried Thatcherism?
Well, I hope not.
It may have gone already. I don't want to be too dramatic.
I mean, there's a short term and a long term here. I think in the short term, most people would accept that now is not the time for austerity of any type, whether that's cuts in public spending or increases in taxes. And the Chancellor has avoided the biggest risks there, which have been to whack up taxes straight away. In the longer term, though, there is still a big battle to be fought. And I obviously would argue that as and when the economy gets back to normal, the state should shrink back again. But there are a lot of people that have been looking at what's been happening over the last few years and saying that actually big state's a great thing and the government can borrow loads of money and spend it wisely. I think the evidence, if anything, is actually against that. But that's the battle that still needs to be fought. So Thatcherism is taking a back seat at the moment, but I think the arguments for free markets will come back again as and when the economy is allowed to work normally again.
Well, Lucy Fisher, the Deputy Political Editor of the Telegraph, and Julian Jessop, an economics fellow at the IEA. Thank you so much for joining us today on Choppers Politics. It's been great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Well, that's all for this budget special of Choppers Politics. I'd love to know your thoughts. Do the announcements mean you can finally buy a home? Are you a business owner trying to get going after the pandemic? Will this budget help? Do get in touch. Email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or tweet us. We're at Choppers Podcast. Thanks to my guests once again this week, Julian Jessop and our very own Lucy Fisher. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Luludis. And most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you enjoyed this programme, please do leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find us. And we'll leave some links to the best Telegraph content and analysis to this budget in the show notes to this episode. We're running a short survey at the moment to find out what you like about our podcasts and how we can improve them. You can find the survey link in the episode description. It should take less than 5 minutes to fill out, and at the end, you can enter a prize draw to win one of 3 £100 John Lewis gift vouchers. How exciting! And as an extra thank you, if you're not already a Telegraph subscriber, go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can get your first month completely free of charge. Don't say we don't treat you, even after a tax-raising budget. And of course, do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph if you can. Until next time then, cheerio!